tonight what I want to try to do is to talk about something that's a major issue but almost never addressed directly, and that is the monumentality of the Athenian Acropolis. It's always referred to as a monumental, one of the great monumental creations of the Western world, but rarely do we actually discuss what that means. It certainly means more than just a bunch of big, beautiful stone buildings. So what I'd like to start out by doing is to think about a little bit about what the meaning of monumentality is in the Greek world in general. And it actually is remarkably consistent that monumental art and architecture from the beginning and for a long time is always constructed, always created at points of profound transition. That is, at boundaries between two radically different states. That is, between human and divine, life and death. Later on, between before and after some really significant historical event. And the purpose of these monumental creations is not just to mark those points, those boundaries, but it's also to put people in the proper state of mind for approaching these things, to transform their everyday attitude into something beyond the everyday, appropriate for contemplating something that is extraordinary. And the way in which this is accomplished is also really consistent. And that is the way in which the attitude is conditioned is by placing the viewer in direct contact with an object that has been radically transformed, an object that has been transformed from something really ordinary into something really extraordinary. And it's really just the wow factor. I mean, that's the beginning of it. That is, you look at something and you go, gosh, that's amazing. And just that puts you into a different state of mind. It makes you begin to contemplate what it is that you're approaching. It makes you think, this must be important. The earliest monumental architecture in Greece, in classical Greece, occurs very early this is the first monumental architecture in Greece after the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were the prehistoric Greeks of the second half of the second millennium BCE, and when their culture ends basically in around 1100, there's a 300-year period in which there's not a lot of cultural production. There's not monumental architecture, there's not monumental art created anymore. And then around 800 BCE, Greece begins to have a renaissance. Homer is written down, the Homeric Epics that refer back to the Mycenaean period, the Trojan War. Buildings that can be identified as temples begin to appear. Writing is rediscovered, or it's borrowed, the alphabet's borrowed from the Phoenicians, and monumental architecture appears. And the earliest examples of monumental architecture are actually pots. And they're grave markers. In Athens, in the Dipylon Cemetery, they are at that boundary between life and death. And the designer who first decided to make these pots, in thinking about what it is that would be appropriate for marking this profound boundary and for conditioning people to approach it, to transform their attitude into something appropriate, he decided that it should be an object that is radically transformed. And so what this looks like any other amphora, a very common utilitarian piece of kitchen machinery that everybody had in their house. You've seen millions of these if you've been to museums, Greek museums. You've seen thousands of these at a much smaller scale. This stands over 5 feet tall. It was blown up in scale to almost unbelievably, and that meant that its function was totally changed as well. It couldn't perform that utilitarian function anymore. And the recognition of this form is what really makes it monumental. It's what really makes it dramatic. Everybody knows this form, but at the moment of realization, when you realize, that's not like my kitchen pot, that's unbelievable, it's huge, it's something totally different. That's the moment of confounded expectation. That's another way to think about monumentality, is this dramatic contrast between the expected and the experienced. So in this, you have to recognize what the original was, what the ordinary is, in order to appreciate the extraordinary. So it's, in this case, it's the transformation of scale that is the active ingredient in the creating of something monumental. Another type of grave marker, another shape, is a crater, and this originates in its utilitarian form, is for mixing wine. This is also transformed through scale, but another way in which it's transformed and made monumental is in the scenes, this processional scene that appears in this lower band. It's a scene of chariots and horses and soldiers wearing a large, I'm going to call it, without explaining it, a figure of 8 shield. It's something that was not part of ordinary experience of 8th century Greeks. We don't have any evidence that they practiced chariot warfare. We don't have any evidence that there were any of these figure of 8 shields, but we do know that Homer, who was written down in the 8th century BCE, describes the heroic battles in the Iliad, and the heroes fought behind figure of 8 shields, and they were in chariots. And what we have here is a scene, a procession that is lifted out of the ordinary, out of the everyday kind of procession, by setting it in a heroic context through this direct reference to the Mycenaeans, who were heroic. They're the heroes of Homer. They are also the direct ancestors of the Greeks. So this one, it's not, this monumentality is accomplished not just by transformation of scale, but also transformation of theme. The Doric Order is, which Michael was talking about, and yes, I do have different ideas about it, but not that it's not about construction, but maybe the origins are from a different time from what we normally think. But the Doric Order, which is the mainland style of monumental architecture in Greece, is its active ingredient is also the transformation of small rubble and mud brick thatched roofed temples of the 8th and early 7th centuries BCE. Very unimpressive. Their purpose was to protect the cult image. And then in the 7th century, they are transformed to stone, not directly to Doric, that takes a little while, but they are transformed into very large scale stone buildings that look like a gigantic stone version of the small temples. So here again, it's a transformation of scale, but it's also a transformation of materials into something that's permanent, something that's expensive, something that's hard to work. The aspect of the Doric Order that most people don't talk about, though, is the connection with the Mycenaeans. And this is a whole different, I don't know whether you don't follow us. Oh, well, anyway, I'll give a lecture on this sometime for you. But the Mycenaeans, one of the things that happens in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE is that there are many religious sites that are inspired by the rediscovery of the Mycenaean past. And it's very often architectural. And rather than just clearing them away or ignoring them, the Greeks started they set up cults there, and they began to worship there, and and very often on those sites later on temples would be constructed. The Greeks were very aware of their heroic past, and it played a large part in the character of their earliest religion. There were, and I'm not going to talk about the rediscovery, there are some remarkable examples of the rediscovery of Mycenaean ruins that actually carry aspects of architecture that are very similar to Doric. I believe that the Doric column itself, whatever the origins of the form, that the columns themselves were directly inspired by Mycenaean columns, Mycenaean capitals, and that they were placed on the temple, as was the pediment. And I'm now going to be tempted to say more about it, but I can't because I'll run out of time. We'll talk about it afterwards. And the pediment, which is not only formally like the Lion's Gate at Mycenae, but also compositionally and the way in which it affects people is exactly the same. I think that the Doric temple, that two of the most important conditioners of approach to it, of your understanding of the temple, are in fact direct and intentional invocations of the Mycenaean heroic past. So that again is the same kind of monumentalization that we saw in that chariot scene on the crater. all of this has to do with approach. All of these monuments that we've talked about so far have to do with approach to the boundary. They have to do with, again, getting ready for this profound experience. This is the same kind of function that religious procession effects. Religious procession is simply a transformed version of an ordinary thing, of walking, into something abstracted, formalized along formal pathways. And the purpose of it is to make people aware of approach. It has everything to do with changing your mindset as you approach. The Ionic Order, which is the architecture of East Greece, of Ionia, across the Aegean Sea, also relies on transformation of scale and materials for its monumentality, but it also directly infuses its architecture with procession, right? Architectural procession. And again, this is a very brief, tiny little discussion of it. But these temples, and I'm just going to walk you around in a very simple way. You have to come to the front of the temple in order to enter. There is, unlike Doric, which has a back porch as well. It's closed at the back. You have to move to the front. The temple is surrounded by a double row of columns. It's a dipteral temple. When you get to the front, you also are directed by this column spacings, which are graduated from the corners to a single largest spacing on the axis of the temple, and then that spacing is reproduced in the second row of this dipteral colonnade, and then in identical pairs of Ionic columns, taking you all the way back into the interior of the temple. Procession was absolutely at the heart of the Ionic order, and it's another way in which people were prepared for that final boundary that they were approaching for communicating with divinity. Now, to move from here to the Athenian Acropolis, in particular the Periclean Acropolis, what the monumentality of the Periclean Acropolis is, we really need to talk for a minute about four major contexts that you have to think about, you have to understand if we're going to begin to understand anything about the meaning or the monumentality of the Acropolis. And the first is, and this is something that we don't think about very much, but in many ways, the most basic aspect of the Periclean Acropolis, or the Acropolis before, is that it was the religious center of Athens. It was the religious center of Athens, and it was first monumentalized. That is, the first monumental buildings were built on the Acropolis about 100 years before the Periclean Acropolis was constructed, and it was monumentalized expressly for the purpose of creating a monumental context for the culminating ceremony of the most important religious festival in Athens, and that was the big birthday party for Athens, for Athena, the Grand Panathenaea, and the culminating ceremony, which was going to culminate on the Acropolis, was a big procession from the Dipylon, from the outskirts, the gate of the city, through the Potter's Quarter and through the Agora, which was the civic center, winds its way up the north slope of the Acropolis, and then around the northwest corner, finally up through the gateway, across the Acropolis from west to east, finally to the most sacred part of the Acropolis, the east end of the temples, the Altar of Athena. Lots of sacrifices were made, and a new dress was given to Athena. This, by the way, is a reenactment of the Panathenaic procession with King Otto when he was inaugurated. And this is from that exact same place. I just did this so you could get an idea of the visual experience of the procession from afar. The point of this is that at the very heart of the Athenian Acropolis is procession. The Acropolis was monumentalized around the requirements of religious procession. Another context that we have to understand is that the Acropolis, the religious center of Athens on the Acropolis, was built on the remains of the Mycenaean palace. Okay? That's something that's very important, as I mentioned to you before, in early Greek religion, and here it's no different. It's built on the foundations of this, and it's associated with the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were the heroic ancestors of the Athenians. The Athenians, one of the reasons that the Athenians felt they were so ancient, one of the symbols of the signs of their great antiquity was that they still spoke the Ionian dialect of Greek. One of the only groups of people in the mainland that spoke the Ionian dialect. That also connected them with the Ionians across the sea. So that it shouldn't be a surprise to us then that the processional religion of the Athenians is something that's very much like the processional nature of the temples in Asia Minor. That is, there were similarities in religion as well, and they had a common ancestor. Third context that we have to understand is that most immediately, most directly, the Periclean Acropolis, the Acropolis as built in the second half of the 5th century, was the reconstruction of the Acropolis after its destruction by the Persians in 480, and then after the final victory over the Persians in 450. That again, we'll see that that's a very, very significant understanding. And finally, we have to understand that the Persian Wars are also what changed the identity and the image of Athens throughout the Greek world. Athens was vaulted to the center of power in the world as a result of these miraculous victories over the Persians, and they were able to do it by forming an alliance of Ionian city-states, a naval alliance. They didn't ally themselves with the Dorian powers. I mean, they were allied, but that wasn't they weren't the center of a naval alliance that included Dorians. Sparta was in charge of the land forces on the mainland. Greece's power lay in the organization of its Ionian allies in the Aegean and on the west coast of Asia Minor, and that league quickly became an Athenian empire. And it was not only with that alliance that they were able to defeat the Persians at sea, but it was also with the funds from the compulsory contributions of the Ionian city-states to Athens that in large part the reconstruction of the Acropolis was able to be undertaken. So how is the Acropolis monumental? Greek architecture, monumental Greek architecture, prepares us for approach to boundaries, but the boundaries and the preparation for approach on the Acropolis are more complex and subtle than anything we've seen before in Greek architecture, but they're also more comprehensive and startlingly new, radically. The entranceway to the Acropolis. The entranceway proper is the propylaea, which is the gateway. That's what the name is. But it has to be seen in conjunction with this little temple of Athena Nike, this little Ionic temple, because from the direct approach from the west, they are definitely part of the same visual experience. But the Athena Nike, as we see from here, is the first part of the entranceway that you see as you're approaching and coming around the northwest corner of the Acropolis, as if you were in the Pan-Athenaic procession. And just by its name, Nike, victory, what we're seeing is that the first theme that's projected to Athens from the Acropolis is victory, victory over the Persians. And this little temple is designed, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but it's designed to be seen primarily from outside of the Acropolis wall. The sculpture on a parapet that surrounds it is facing out, not in. The back porch, the columns here are not even visible from the Acropolis itself. They're only visible from the outside. Its purpose is to engage people before they come to the Acropolis and prepare them for the theme of victory that is going to be reiterated time and again on the Acropolis. Not specifically the Persian victory as represented in, for instance, this gigantic bronze statue of Athena Promachos, Athena in the forefront of battle that was cast from the captured arms and weapons, arms and armor of the Persians at Marathon, the first and most miraculous of Athenian victories, but also on the Parthenon in the sculpture, the sculpted metopes, the 96 sculpted metopes around the outside, all of which have to do with the victory of Greeks or their gods over barbarian forces. Those were traditional themes, but in the context of the Persian War and the importance of victory over the Persians on the Acropolis, they took on a completely different kind of meaning. So Ionic is appropriate for the presentation of contemporary history, the Persian War victory. Also, the fact that it was an Ionian alliance that made that victory possible. And Ionic is the order of Ionian. And the fact that the building program was made possible in large part by donations from Ionia. But it was also appropriate for the representation of and celebration of the ancient history of the Athenians, remembering that the Ionian dialect was an ancient dialect, and remembering especially that the Mycenaeans, the heroic ancestors of the Athenians, were in fact the basis of this religious center. It was founded on that. In fact, the little Temple of Athena Nike rests atop the old Mycenaean bastion, the defensive bastion that protected the entranceway to the Acropolis. And that it was sheathed in classical masonry, but that they were absolutely intent upon invoking the Mycenaean past and recognizing their dependence on it, and also consequently monumentalizing, lifting their own construction out of the ordinary. They left a window on the north side here, which gave, in this masonry, which gave immediate visual and tactile access to the big, gigantic cyclopean stones that formed the basis of this tower. It was a direct visual connection with the Mycenaean past. The same thing is true of the propylaea. It continues this theme of ancient history, a theme that we'll see is carried on. It also prepares the viewer for what's going to happen on the Acropolis. In the U-shaped plan of the propylaea. The U-shaped plan of the propylaea, together with this bastion, with the Athena Nike temple on it, the Mycenaean bastion, creates very much the same kind of enclosed courtyard, an enclosed entranceway as Mycenaean palaces. Not just the palace here, the gateway, the defensive gateway, but also at Mycenae in the lionsgate there. And the fact that this was intentional and not just an accident is indicated by this, not just the window that is giving us connection with the Mycenaean past, but also in the decision of the architect of the propylaea to include as part of the propylaea, the southwest side of the propylaea, a very tall section of the ancient Mycenaean fortification wall into the propylaea itself. It performs no practical function whatsoever. It's purely visual. Its purpose was the association with the ancient past and the consequent lifting of the present out of the ordinary. So the Ionic order helped prepare the viewer for many expressions of contemporary history on the Acropolis. It also foreshadowed the celebration of the ancient heroic history of the Athenians. The other temple on the Acropolis that is explicitly Ionic, like the Temple of Athena Nike, is the Erechtheion. And this Erechtheion is a rebuilding of the Temple of Athena Polios, which was the most important temple on the Acropolis. It housed the ancient image of Athena. It was Athena, of the tutelary divinity of Athens. And so it did house her cult, and it was a very important part of the Pan-Athenic procession and the final ritual. But it also housed many cults that had to do specifically with the origins of Athens, with the mythical foundations of Athens. In other words, the very, very ancient history. And surely the inspiration for these had to at least be in part the fact that the Athena Polios temple had been founded on the remains of the Mycenaean palace, over where probably the king's megaron was. So here again, the two Ionic temples that are on the Acropolis are directly related to the history of the Athenians. They're absolutely appropriate to them in their Ionic order, both for ancient history and for contemporary history. And another aspect of them that is different from the other temples on the Acropolis is that these two Ionic temples are also the only temples on the Acropolis that actually are designed, at least in a significant part, not all of it in the Erechtheion, and not all of it in the Nike temple either, but to directly address the city of Athens beyond the Acropolis walls. Even the Parthenon directly addresses, or it may be, this is a controversial point too, but directly engages and addresses ancient history with the Ionic order in the back room of the Parthenon, where there are 4 Ionic columns, and they are Ionic, I think, because I think it's very likely that they are standing above a Mycenaean grave that was very significant for the original foundation of the Acropolis, of the religious center of the Acropolis. So in all of these buildings, we have some kind of recognition of ancient history as well as contemporary history. So the Nike temple and the Ionic order project far beyond the Acropolis walls these themes: the causal theme of history, the victory over the Persians, the international nature of the contemporary history of the Athenians, also its most ancient history, and foreshadowed the Erechtheions and the Parthenons concerned with the same, but perhaps most important in the choice of Ionic, the architectural style of East Greece, not the mainland of Greece, instead of Doric, is that it projected the significance of religious procession to the history and meaning of the Periclean Acropolis. The Ionic order was designed originally in the service of processional religion. The Propylaea did lots of different things, as you'd expect for an entranceway. It foreshadowed many, many themes on all the themes on the Acropolis, particularly if you look at it and the Nike temple together as the entranceway. And it is ostensibly Doric. It has Doric-shaped columns and a Doric frieze, and it's always described as Doric, but in fact it operates by exactly the same processional language as the Ionic of Asia Minor. And that is, the spacings of the columns are graduated from corners to a large central intercolumniation. That intercolumniation, if again, you can make up lots of reasons for this, it certainly accomplished lots of things other than just being processional. But the consciousness of the Ionic nature of this is shown absolutely unambiguously in the fact that widest central intercolumniation is repeated by pairs of identical columns, just as they are in the Ionic architecture of Asia Minor. Here you can see it in the section of this building, taking you deep into the interior of the building. This processional theme continues in the Parthenon. The Parthenon is, and I think at the end of this lecture, we'll see that, I think you might start to see how different these things are from what came before, even though I didn't have time to show you images of the way things were before. But just in its scale, the Ionic temples of Asia Minor were colossal. They were 4 times as large as the largest Doric temples of their time in the 6th century BCE. They were immense. And just in terms of scale, the Parthenon is more Ionic than it is Doric. It was the largest temple ever completed on the mainland of Greece, and it was larger even than the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. That's a kind of abstract Ionicism. The fact that it has 8 columns across the facade is something that is purely Ionic. The Ionic temples had octostyle facades instead of hexastyle facades. The Doric temples had 6 columns. Also across the ends of the temple you have dipteral porches. That is, remember the two rows of columns going around Ionic. There are many direct references to Ionic. And there's even an Ionic frieze that runs around the temple from west to east along the tops of the cellar walls, that turns at the end, comes to the central axis of the temple where it culminates, and then with this and then you are facing the most elaborately decorative interior in Doric architecture to that point, which housed the most fantastic cult image that had ever been built at that time, the great Chryselephanti golden ivory statue of Athena, Parthenos. And what's she doing? And I can't see it here very well. But she is standing there in the aftermath of war, extending on her massive right hand a tiny, well, it's not actually tiny, but tiny in comparison to her, statue of Athena Nike to the viewer in exactly the same way that the Propylaea has foreshadowed this in the extension of the little Temple of Athena Nike to the people, projecting this theme of victory over the Persians to the Athenians. And now I'm going to read for a few minutes and just try to pull all this together for you. Though tiny in comparison with the other buildings of the Periclean Acropolis, the Nike Temple, the initial experience of the Gateway complex, played a significant role in the monumental task of preparing those approaching for what was to come, helped them begin to consider themes of most ancient, heroic mythical history, themes of absolutely contemporary history, themes of the traditional religious nature of the Acropolis, and even of the specific architectural and sculptural nature of the buildings beyond the entranceway. And central to the accomplishment of all of this was the choice of Ionic. Ionic as appropriate to the most ancient roots of Athens, as evidenced by the Ionian dialect they spoke. Ionic as appropriate to the present Ionian Empire. Ionian as appropriate to the processional nature of religious practice on the Acropolis and of the processional nature of the architecture itself on the Periclean Acropolis. And this is where I'm going to introduce something new. And Ionic as the catalyst for the experience of monumental drama, of confounded expectation, the drama of Doric expectations but Ionic experience, the expectation of familiar local traditions but the experience of international synthesis. In other words, the dramatic transformation of the ordinary into the truly extraordinary. The drama of transformation in the earliest examples of monumental Greek architecture is clear and simple. The temple's original transformation from ordinary, ephemeral materials, simple surface, and unremarkable scale into a huge, intricately carved, permanent stone structure rife with direct visual references to the heroic structures of the Mycenaeans must have been powerful in its original effect. But by the time of the Periclean building program on the Acropolis, Doric temples had been created in much the same way for a very long time, and the original drama of transformation was less immediate. The contrast between expected and experience was much less radical. Expectation had changed from a small-scale rubble and mud brick structure built in the local vernacular tradition to the now long familiar stone Doric temple. The extraordinary imagination and ambition of Pericles' architects, however, set in the midst of the profound shift of Athens' psyche and position in the world that had resulted from the long war with Persia, spawned architectural transformations at least as disorienting and as monumental in their denial of expectations as the transformations inherent in the original monumental architecture of Greece. Doric was the architectural liturgy of mainland Greece, fixed, unchanging, and the radical break from its traditional rules that occurred on the Periclean Acropolis, the internationalization of the architectural expression of the traditional cults of Athens and the temple architecture of Athens' traditional religious center, could have been possible only in the context of an Athens whose almost miraculous accomplishments in the war against Persia had elevated her in her own eyes and in the eyes of many of the Greeks to an almost mythical status. An Athens who now stood at the head of a new international empire, an Ionic empire centered on the Doric mainland. One of the most basic traditional goals of monumental Greek architecture was the transformation of attitude through the agency of its own radical transformation. The Propylaea was emphatically transformed from a traditional Greek gateway through its unprecedented scale, stacked pediments, and enveloping forecourt. The heroic Mycenaean reference of the forecourt plan and the visual access to the foundation blocks of the old Mycenaean bastion further lifted the Propylaea and the gateway complex into the realm of the extraordinary. So did the Propylaea's hexastyle facade, six-column facade, which even from a great distance spoke the language of a Doric temple rather than that of the universal tradition in Greek, of the universal tradition in Greece going back to the Mycenaeans of more modest distile gateways, that is, two-columned gateways. The wow factor. If the gateway of the Periclean Acropolis had been transformed into a temple, how grand the temples within must be. The primary purpose of Greek monumental architecture was to condition approach to an important boundary, and the propylaea, like the Nike temple, was excellent preparation for the multifaceted experience that lay beyond the border between secular Athens and the sanctuary of Athena within the Acropolis walls. Unlike any gateway before, and absolutely appropriately for the unprecedented architecture that lay beyond, the fusing in the propylaea Nike complex of Doric and Ionic form, of its spirit and allusion, introduced the themes of victory, procession, contemporary history, and the heroic origins of Athens that dominated the meaning and experience of the Acropolis within. Immediately beyond the propylaea lay another surprise. The Athenians' most dramatic experience of wrenching change had occurred when the Persians leveled and torched the Acropolis, and in the ruined temples and monuments that they left unreconstructed for the last 30 years of the war, and in the ruined temples and monuments that they left unreconstructed for the last 30 years of the war, they recognized a unique opportunity for an unprecedented experience of monumentality. The emotional mechanism of the experience of the total and continuing ruin of their religious center for 30 years was absolutely consistent with the transformational effect of traditional monumental architecture through its inherent comparison between the everyday and the extraordinary. Here on the ruined Acropolis, the extraordinary was tragic and created in the Athenians an attitude appropriate to the continued prosecution of the war against Persia, as well as to the development of their own self-image as heroic. That is, the extraordinary aspect of the ruin of the Acropolis in those years before it was reconstructed was what it had been like, the expected, the ordinary, which was a complete monumental complex, and instead you saw from down below and on the Acropolis itself just total destruction. So effective was this inadvertent discovery and so emblematic of the new character of Athens that the Athenians intentionally placed it at the center of their grand Periclean rebuilding, intentionally leaving the Temple of Athena Polios, the most, right here, these foundations, this empty space. It's not empty in reality, but this empty space. Leaving the Temple of Athena Polios, the most holy temple on the Acropolis, the home of the ancient cult image of Athena, in ruins as high as the roof in places, while the rest of the pre-Persian Acropolis was cleared away and rebuilt. Rather than the sparkling new Parthenon, emblem of the new wealth and power and position of Athens, it was the ruined temple of Athena Polios on which the Periclean gateway, right here, on which the Periclean gateway now focused, and that dominated the immediate experience of passage from propylaea onto the new Acropolis. The Parthenon is the largest and in many ways the most impressive building on the Periclean Acropolis, and it stands at the highest point in the sanctuary. Its fusion and synthesis of Ionic and Doric, of Ionia and Athens, defined the Parthenon, as it did the propylaea, as something altogether new and simultaneously as a product of local tradition. Its Doric columns and entablature barely distracted from the transformation of the traditional hexastyle facades of Doric into Ionic-inspired octastyle dipteral porches, which in concert with the processional language of the sculptural program led, like the temples of Ionia, to the front, to the axis, and then into the cellar. The great monumental drama of the Parthenon lay not only in its tremendous size, greater than any temple that had ever been completed on the mainland, including the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and greater than all but a very few Athenians had ever seen, but also in the new international language it spoke. In addition, it was the most elaborately sculpted temple in the Greek world, with all 96 metopes carved, as well as the Ionic frieze and both pediments. Everything about the Parthenon must have seemed new and extravagant and hugely impressive in comparison to any temple the Athenians had ever before known. The overwhelmingly detailed surface decoration of the Parthenon contrasted with all Greek temples that had come before it, and consequently contributed to its monumentality through the traditional contrast between the expected and the experienced. Equally remarkable was the introduction of barely visible distortions to all horizontal and vertical lines and planes in the temple. All horizontals were now transformed into barely perceptible convex curves, all verticals tilted slightly out of plumb. Nearly a century earlier, convex curvature had been introduced to the Greek temple style elevated to the peristyle floor for the simple utilitarian purpose of drainage. But like many other practical aspects of the temple, curvature was ultimately transformed from the purely utilitarian into something worthy of aesthetic exploration. In the context of a deepening Greek interest in the physics of sight and human perception, these curves came to be appreciated and explored in terms of their visual effect. Whether they actually counteracted optical illusions inherent in large-scale unbroken horizontal lines, the most common interpretation of their purpose, they did extend the monumental experience to the subconscious. Though barely visible, if consciously perceptible at all, the subtle curves and tilts in the Parthenon registered on the retina and somewhere in the brain, and thus on an essentially subconscious level, denied the most basic expectation of post and lintel architecture, that is, clean verticals and horizontals. This is a remarkably subtle expression of a basic principle of monumentality. The Parthenon was the architectural climax of the Periclean Acropolis and the culmination of its architectural procession. But it was not experienced in a vacuum. It was the juxtaposition of Athena Polios on the left, which here are the ruins right now, the ruined foundations of Athena Polios, though at this time it was standing much, much higher than this. It was the juxtaposition of the Athena Polios ruin on the left of the Sacred Way and the Parthenon on the right that dominated the culminating experience of the Pan-Athenaic procession as it approached the Altar of Athena, and that emphasized the astounding transformation of the Acropolis and of Athens from near extinction at the hands of the Persians to bright emblem and powerful center of the Greek world, now finally free from the Persian nightmare. Here, the comparison between what Athens had been for 30 years, that is, in ruins, and what it had now become was explicit in the jarring contrast between left and right, old and new, broken and whole, defeated and victorious. The Parthenon today is still a marvelously impressive building, and its unprecedented size and surface decoration and optical refinements and dipteral porches and Ionic processional language and human reference and elaborate interior and colossal cult image would all have defied contemporary expectation and would on their own have created for the Athenians a truly unprecedented monumental experience. But in the end, the scale and the sculpture and the bright marble of the new Parthenon were surely all the more magnificent and emotionally charged in the reflection of the charred ruins of the venerable temple of Athena Polios. We can only try to imagine today how much more powerful the monumental impact of the Parthenon, and for that matter, of the Propylaea and the Nike temple and the Erechtheion and the still standing temple of Athena Polios would have been when complete, in full color, in full contrast, and in their original context as an integrated whole.